On Zombie Reddit, today's story is...
My sister accused me of seducing her husband and he revealed that their baby was his coworker's. My name is Sarah, I'm 22 years old and I've just finished my business administration studies. At the beginning of this week, my parents organized a celebration for my graduation that ended in disaster because of my older sister Gina, who is 26. Our relationship has never been good. She has a constant need to be the center of attention and can't stand it when someone else receives attention, especially me. Over the years we have had numerous conflicts for this reason. Until now, out of consideration for my parents, I had tolerated her unbearable behavior, but after what happened at my party, I reached my limit and I have no intention of backing down. At previous celebrations, she always found a way to divert attention to herself and her life. But this time she went further, she got up to make a toast. For a moment I was transfixed, naively hoping she would say something positive about me. Instead, she started to tell a completely false story about how, a few months ago, I had supposedly been flirting with her husband while she was 6 months pregnant. She called me brazen and a homewrecker, practically suggesting that I was a woman of questionable morals. Naturally, nobody believed her as everyone in the family knows my true character. My parents, relatives, and friends immediately came to my defense and asked her to shut up. But it was my brother-in-law Michael's reaction that made the difference. At first he was as stunned as I was, but then he seemed to understand the situation. He calmed everyone down and proceeded to explain what had really happened. About the incident that led to Gina's accusations, it had indeed happened a couple of months ago. All I did was send a message to Michael, who despite my bad relationship with Gina, has always been kind to me. The message was nothing suspicious, I simply asked him for information about his job as a financial consultant, as I was interested in knowing what that career could be like for me in the future. We had a brief professional conversation and that was it. Michael mentioned this to Gina who, of course, drew the worst conclusions about me. At the party, after drinking too much, she decided to make the matter public. She completely distorted the situation, presenting it as something sordid and inappropriate on my part, when it had only been a professional consultation. She fabricated a whole drama where none existed. After Michael had cleared up the situation in front of all the guests, she made another revelation. She said that she had been holding back this information so as not to overshadow my graduation party, but since Gina was so concerned with questioning my morals, she thought it appropriate to talk about hers. By this point, everyone was quite upset, and when Michael mentioned that he would be discussing Gina's character, she began to scream hysterically, but he continued undaunted. He announced that earlier that week he had taken a paternity test and, just 2 days before my party, discovered that the baby was not his. Gina was in shock. Michael explained that he had begun to suspect possible infidelity during a work party they had attended together, where he had noticed that she had acted too familiarly with a work colleague. He had checked her phone while she slept and found unequivocally romantic messages between them. The following day he had requested the paternity test, but decided to keep everything a secret because he didn't want to ruin the celebration that my parents had organized with so much effort and money. Despite his anger with Gina, he didn't think it was fair that my parents and I should pay for her actions, as we had always treated her well. But since the party was ruined, he decided to reveal the truth so that at least Gina wouldn't get away scot-free after defaming me. We were all speechless as Gina cried. After her revelation, Michael simply handed me my gift, congratulated me and left. For a few moments, no one knew how to react, but then I realized that it was all Gina's fault and I lost control. Furious, I grabbed her by the arm and shouted in front of everyone that this was her responsibility. I called her a useless attention seeker and demanded that she leave immediately. I was furious because she had ruined my celebration. The business degree is not easy and I had worked very hard for my grades, but she couldn't bear to see me celebrated even for a day. These kinds of situations have been frequent throughout my life, and I had learned to tolerate them because that's the way she is. She always needs to be the center of attention and can't stand it when I receive any recognition. Out of consideration for my parents, I had never confronted the problem publicly to avoid uncomfortable situations, but that day I couldn't take it anymore. It was the last straw, especially considering that she tried to suggest that I was morally questionable for allegedly flirting with her husband during her pregnancy, when she was the one who had really been cheating on him with a coworker. She was so enraged that I continued to insult her while she cried, trying to throw her out of the place, but she refused, saying that I had no right to expel her because our parents had paid for everything and she would only leave if they asked her to. At that moment, completely beside myself, I slapped her so hard that her glasses flew off. I didn't stop there and I kept hitting her until some friends pulled me away. It wasn't my finest moment, but I couldn't help myself. I think it was an inevitable outburst after years of repressing my feelings. My friends took me to another part of the venue to calm down. After about 15 minutes, my parents called us back and, as the evening was completely ruined, we sent all the guests away with takeaway food. On the way home, my parents told me that my sister and I had embarrassed them and that they couldn't believe that I, of all people, had lost control like that and behaved so irrationally. Naturally, I resented being blamed, so I tried to defend myself, but they told me it didn't matter if I had been holding in my feelings for years because in the end I had let them dominate me and behaved totally unacceptably in public, humiliating them. I take their point, but I think they are being unfair to me and that such a reaction was inevitable, especially when they constantly forced us to pretend to be a happy family. Addition, a word about my parents. They have always been fairly relaxed about our upbringing, but because of the problems between my sister and I, they have had to intervene frequently. To be fair, they have always tried to keep the peace between us. They have never pitted us against each other or created competition. They have always tried to be equitable and celebrate the achievements of both of us. They were just as happy when she got engaged a couple of years ago as when I got into the business school of my choice. In that sense, they have always been fair, and I can understand why the scandal at the party bothered them, as they are very image conscious. Even if they weren't, any normal person would feel embarrassed about what happened, so I feel bad and have second thoughts about my actions. If they had been unfair parents, I wouldn't even hesitate to accuse them and I would have cut off contact a long time ago, but that's the problem. They have always been fair to both of them and all they asked was to avoid drama in public. When Gina annoyed me, I kept my comments to myself until later and they would reprimand her if they considered her behavior inappropriate, but that was all they could do. They could only ask her not to act that way but not control her behavior the next time we had to pretend to be a happy family. Personally, I would have liked her to be excluded from the family because of her behavior, but they never did and that's why we were forced to live together so often. I think they should have anticipated that this would happen because even the most patient person can explode if they are pushed too far, which is what happened to me. That's why I'm so confused about all this right now. I just don't know what to say or do, especially about my parents. Update 1. I spoke to my parents and expressed everything I felt. I told them that I thought it was unfair that they expected me to constantly tolerate my sister, especially knowing that I didn't like her or her behavior. I also pointed out that they noticed how I was always trying to provoke me and that they should have foreseen this outcome. It was foreseeable that if they kept forcing us to be together, eventually one of us would explode, and that's what happened. Therefore, this should not have surprised them. For them to expect me to contain my anger even after she ruined my party and tried to humiliate me in the worst possible way is simply irrational on their part. Just because they didn't want anyone to know that we had serious family problems, they kept pretending that everything was fine. That's why I had to suppress my feelings, because Gina clearly didn't care in the slightest and would always do her best to provoke me. Suddenly, it became my responsibility to keep calm and not let her get to me, and my parents didn't even realize how much pressure that put on me over and over again. So, while I recognize that I could have handled the situation better, I don't regret exploding the way I did because I had been pushed to that point. I told my parents that if they still thought I was to blame for my behavior, then I would cut them out of my life because they clearly didn't understand me as well as I thought they did. I spoke to them yesterday, 4 days after the incident. During that time we had barely communicated, so the situation was tense and I didn't know what to expect. But after our conversation, they seemed to understand my point of view and finally apologized. They admitted that they hadn't considered things from my perspective and that they had been selfish in worrying too much about their image, which forced me to constantly pretend that my sister's behavior didn't affect me. They hadn't realized how serious the situation was, and during the 4 days after the incident they had also reflected on how my outburst and behavior had been very atypical of me, as I am normally a fairly level-headed person, so I must have been in a very dark place to act like that, and they felt very guilty for having created that situation in the first place. I told them it wasn't entirely their fault, although I was annoyed that they said they were disappointed in me. My parents told me that when I called them, they had already been thinking of contacting me to apologize for what they had said, because at the end of the day, I had remained silent long enough and at some point they should have expected me to respond. They told me that they had also spoken to Gina and asked her to apologize publicly to everyone for what she had said at the party, as it had been very embarrassing and humiliating for the family. But, being Gina as she is, she turned it back on them, saying that she was the one who had been humiliated because I had hit her violently, so in any case, I should be the one to apologize. She also said that I should consider myself lucky that she didn't go to the police, because she might well do, since even if there was provocation, it was only verbal and she didn't attack me physically, which I did. My parents defended me, saying that she had started the whole problem and, given her history of her always trying to provoke me, I should have expected this reaction at some point. And although resorting to violence was not the answer, surely it couldn't have surprised her that this time I didn't let it pass. Then they argued. She accused them of always treating me as the favorite, which is completely untrue. She expressed the same complaints that, although they never liked me, they always forced us into situations where we had to pretend to get along, and they should have thought of her too. So now my parents have decided that for any future meetings or celebrations they organize, only I will be invited, because at least I had the decency to hold back and not embarrass them in public until I simply couldn't take it anymore. But Gina had always been a provocateur, constantly looking to create problems in situations like this, and it was about time she faced the consequences. So now my parents won't talk to her or invite her to anything, especially until she apologizes to all the guests at the party, because everyone knows she started the whole problem. I'm satisfied with this. It's exactly what she deserves. And I'm also glad my parents apologized, because apart from what happened recently, I have a good relationship with them and I didn't want to lose it. Update 2. It's been a few days since my last update and I've been in touch with my parents, but they haven't been talking to Gina. So this morning she called them to ask why they were ignoring her. They reminded her that they had already asked her for a public apology which she hadn't given, and after their last argument, they didn't want to talk to her anyway. Once again, she brought up the subject of being the less favorite daughter, accusing them of treating her unfairly. My parents, fed up with the situation, told her to leave, because she had embarrassed them beyond words with her actions and they no longer wanted anything to do with her. They were completely exhausted from her behavior and expected nothing more from her. Just as they were about to hang up, she burst into tears, saying that she had nowhere to go, which was why she was calling. Apparently, after the party, Michael had asked her to leave the house. He stayed with the baby and told her that he would look after him until she found a permanent place. She tried to reason with him, but he stood his ground, so she had to stay with a friend. However, now that friend doesn't want her to stay anymore because she lives with her boyfriend and, naturally, it's uncomfortable having Gina there. So Gina called our parents to see if she could stay with them and the baby until the whole divorce thing was sorted out. They told her they needed to think about it, hung up and called me to ask what to do because they were completely lost. On the one hand, it was a dilemma for them because they didn't want to help Gina at the moment, especially after her behavior at the party, as that would be quite disrespectful and insensitive towards me. But on the other hand, they didn't want to leave her without a place to stay either, as that would affect her grandson, because Michael had made it clear that he was not going to look after him permanently if she couldn't find somewhere to live. The baby is only a few months old and she needs all the help she can get to look after him because Michael has said that he will only give her until the end of the month to find somewhere to live, and then she and the baby will have to fend for themselves. He will not take any responsibility for the child, which is understandable as he is not the child's father. Considering all this, Gina turned to our parents and they asked me for advice. I could have been mean and told them not to help her, to let her solve her problems alone, but honestly, I was only thinking of the baby. Because in this whole situation, if there is anyone completely innocent, it is the baby, and yet it seemed that no matter whose fault it was, he would be the one who would suffer the most. So without hesitation, I told my parents that they should definitely help her at this point, as I didn't want them to regret rejecting her in the future or blame me for advising them to do so. And also because, as I mentioned, my only concern was for the baby's well-being. When I told my parents that I wanted them to help her, they started praising me and my mom even started crying. She told me she knew I would say exactly that because that's the kind of person I am. Despite everything that happened with Gina, I'm not willing to take things to a level where I could end up hurting her son in an irreversible way. She told me she is proud of me for doing the right thing. So as long as I have that recognition, I really don't care about Gina or anything else. The only thing that worries me a little is that things will be very awkward if I go to dinner or something like that at my parents' house, because I try to meet with them at least once a week. So this week I could ask them to come to my house for lunch or dinner, because if I go to theirs, I'm sure there will be a lot of drama to deal with since Gina will be there. It's not that I'm afraid to face her, I just don't want to see her right now. It's all still very recent, and although I've told my parents that she can stay with them and that she won't bother me, that doesn't mean that I have to see her and be nice to her. I don't like her, I don't think I'll ever like her, and that's why I'll keep my distance, and I think my parents will understand. Either way, I'm very happy with the decision I made because at least it won't weigh on my conscience if I had decided otherwise. I'm also glad that my parents decided to consult me first before making a decision on their own, as it just shows that they consider me very important in their lives and I really value and respect that. Update 3. Today I finally went to my parents' house for dinner. For the last 2 weeks they had been visiting me at my house, but today they insisted that it was time for me to go and that we didn't have to be so cautious just because Gina would be there. At first I hesitated, but then I realized that they were right. I don't have to alter my whole routine just because she's there. If anything, she should be grateful because it was me who convinced our parents to let her stay with them and their son. As expected, as soon as I walked through the door, she started making faces and muttering under her breath as if that would affect me. But this time my parents were ready for her and reprimanded her immediately. They told her that she needed to stop and start behaving normally because, if it hadn't been for my advice, they probably wouldn't have taken her in the first place. And now that she's living with them, she has to behave as they expect her to. When she tried to defend herself, my mom reminded her that even though she hadn't offered a public apology after what happened at the party, they had still taken her in because they love their grandson. But that doesn't mean they've completely forgiven her, and if she wants to continue being part of the family, she'll have to learn to behave and control herself, because this kind of irrational behavior will no longer be tolerated. They told her that they had put up with it for long enough, hoping that he would change, but he never did. And yet, despite that, he had been allowed to stay with his parents when he had nowhere else to go, and even I had been generous enough not to object. So, since we were all being so understanding with her, she needed to start acting with gratitude or she would find herself back on the street. After that, she was quite shocked because I don't think she had ever been spoken to like that before, and even I was surprised because my parents are usually very gentle even when they reprimand someone. But I guess her words had an effect, because instead of spending the rest of the afternoon sitting with us making sarcastic comments and gestures about me, as she would normally have done, she decided to stay in the spare room where she was staying and only came out for dinner and when she had to feed her son. The rest of the time, my parents and I were able to converse freely without interruption, and this is the best we can hope for all of us, so I'll settle for that. Update 4. Hi, it's been several months and Gina's divorce has been officially finalized. She and Michael are no longer together and, although during this time she found a place to live, she decided to stay with our parents because the man with whom she had the affair, the baby's real biological father, refused to pay child support. She thought it would be cheaper to stay with her parents because they could help her and she wouldn't have to pay separately for babysitting or rent, which will save her a lot of money. My parents have agreed because they can spend a lot of time with their grandson and I can also spend time with my nephew, as Gina will be returning to work in a few weeks. If she is bothered by the situation, she doesn't show it, probably because she knows she can't afford to irritate our parents at the moment. The baby is fine, he seems to like me, so I really don't care what Gina thinks. My parents have also been very clever about the whole situation and have legal custody of the baby according to an agreement they made her sign. Things are still tense between them, so I think that measure was necessary. For now, the situation is working out quite well and I think everyone is happy with their position in this family. Gina and I obviously still don't talk to each other and we're not interested in repairing our relationship either, but we've reached a point where at least we're not in constant conflict, so I consider that a significant improvement.